Who are you, and why should people listen to this episode of Pod Friends?
My name is Stancy, and I just gotta ask are you the type of person who wants to hear these open and insightful conversations?
Correct!
Are you the type of person who loves it when people just open up about all of their trauma and all of the things they've gone through and how they're able to channel that into positive energy?
Correct!
And are you the type of person who just enjoys hearing other people talk just because you've got no one else to talk to? You're stuck in traffic and you just want to keep yourself sane for the next hour and a half?
Correct!
Here's Pod Friends.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Pod Friends. I'm your host, Matt Scott, here, joining you for another edition of Pod Friends. That wonderful song was Pod Friends by Will from America, and I am just so happy to be here with all of you. And just as we settle in, I want to check in. How's everyone doing? I'll wait. I'm listening. I know some of you are probably checking your podcast app like, Matt, is the podcast working? Like, no. Like, let me know. Say it out loud. How are you doing? It's important that we check in about those things. And I think one of the things I appreciate most coming off of the episode with Aman, where in part we talked about mental health, going into this episode where mental health is also a theme, I love how open everyone could be in sharing their journey and sharing how they're feeling, but also the ways that they've navigated a lot of the challenges in that journey. Even going back a few episodes, I think of Greg Dunlap, who is an RHAP patron and someone who shared his journey with drinking but more importantly being sober for almost 3 decades and what he's learned from that. I know that there's so much that people could kind of gain other than just like the fun and the joy and entertainment, which is the other thing I love about all these podcasts, including today's episode, but also just like skills for life and figuring things out. And I love that I could learn and feel the love from our guests, and I hope that you do too. And if you are feeling the love, before I talk about this week's guest, feel free to pause this podcast and leave a voicemail. Speakpipe.com/podfriends. That's speakpipe.com/podfriends. I want to get all of your voicemails. I want to hear from you. Up to 90 seconds of something from Pod Friends that's really resonated with you, because one day I will share those on the podcast before the end of this season of Pod Friends. So again, that's speakpipe.com/podfriends. I have so many more plugs and things I want to promote. But first and foremost, let me just talk about this week's guest. Stancy is someone who is really incredible, who I admire, who is a part of the RHAP community, but is definitely one of the members of the community who's less known than some others. And yet he is doing some really phenomenal, groundbreaking work in Manila, Philippines, where he lives. And when it comes to the topics of representation, when it comes to the topic of how to create your dream career, how to even make a career in podcasting, in radio, in media, in announcing, and being like a theatrical personality. We talked about that. We also talk about how Stan, who is not only someone who's been a radio DJ, TV and event host, he's a WWE, that's Pro Wrestling Tagalog announcer, so translating and also kind of commentating the experience of a pro wrestling show to listeners in the Philippines. He is someone who has so much experience doing this for real. I actually have learned so much from him just in knowing him the last couple of years in my RHAP journey. And so this is one that I'm hoping, whether or not you know Stan, that you could tune in, you could learn from him, learn from his story of, like, I think a lot of us who are podcasters and who put our voices out there, or even a lot of us who are listeners of RHAP, you know, he was someone who was silenced as a kid growing up. And so it took that extra boost of courage to find his voice. And now he's doing that not only in the Philippines, but on a global scale and only just getting started. So get in with Stan C right now on the ground floor. But as we do that, I just want to encourage you all, not only again to leave voice messages, but to follow Pod Friends at Hey Pod Friends. Follow me on social media at Matt Scott GW. You could also tag and tweet at Stan with your thoughts of this episode and of him, and just to connect with him at _Stan C. And if you want to suggest a guest for Pod Friends, bit.ly/podfriendsnam to let me know who you want to see on future Pod Friends episodes. We have more episodes coming this season, going through the start of Survivor 43, which is at the end of September. And so hopefully you could let me know who else you want to see on, and they might just be here. But for more on just ways to support Pod Friends, you could check out the show notes. And again, hope that you're subscribed. Hope you're leaving those 5 stars. Hope you're leaving a review. Those really go a long way just to letting me know, letting us know that Pod Friends is something that you all want to see and enjoy and experience. So that's all I have for today. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. But now, please let me introduce this week's guest. Making his way to the podcast, hailing from the capital of the Philippines, he is a voiceover artist, voice actor, podcaster, radio DJ, TV and events host, writer, frequent flyer, and so much more. Known for his work on the Wrestling Podcast, the longest running weekly episodic Filipino wrestling podcast, On Deck with Stan C, now steaming a Chinoy podcast, and his role as WWE's Tagalog announcer. From Manila, the Thrilla, the voice of the wrestling people, and a fan and proponent of representation for all, he is Stan C. Stan, actually, I want to know from you, as a professional in this field, podcaster, announcer, radio DJ, voiceover artist, all of the things, as a person with a voice, Stan, do you have any throat secrets?
Get sleep. As in, prioritize your sleep. When I was younger and when I was breaking into the business, I did not prioritize sleep, and I realized how that really messed me up. So I've since learned, when I have a big gig coming up the next day or a big project I need to work on, I need to make sure I actually get my 6 to 7 hours of sleep. I can get by on 6, actually. So there's that. Hydrate, super important. That's why I've got my bottle every time I'm podcasting. Always keep yourself hydrated. And then learn where you get your energy from. This is one of those professional tips I've learned from the workshops I've taken. You have to know how to harness your energy. So, for example, I'm seated right now inside my booth, right? But when I'm doing my professional recordings for commercials or for TV and stuff like that, I actually stand up. Because you get more energy when you're standing up. You're more animated. You can harness your diaphragm better. The real veterans can actually tell whether you're seated or not when you're recording. I'm not at that level yet, but I aspire to get to that level.
Is it okay to stand and squat while you're podcasting? Could you tell that I'm standing and squatting right now?
It probably depends on what vibe you're trying to give off. For commercial recordings, for example, some of the briefs that I get, the director will say something like, "Oh, we need you to be energetic for this one," really doing a hard sell. Or I did this one recording where they tried to get me to sound all ASMR, I'm trying to do pillow talk with a lover. So for that one, I had to be less energetic.
What did that sound like?
So I had to get real close to the mic and just whisper and turn on the dulcet tones and let them just imagine that I'm whispering sweet nothings in their ear right before I slit their throat in a blindside.
Oh my God. No. I was just enjoying my ASMR experience, and then that turned. It went. I don't even know. It just. I don't know if it went from it went from like Love Island to Survivor, basically, in like
Yeah,
2 seconds. And I was not ready for that. This is awesome, man. I'm glad to have you on, and even just like honestly, the way that in this very short time in the couple minutes since we've started this interview, really, Stan, it's obvious you're a pro because you use the word diaphragm, and that is like very technical language for the body throat speaking box area. So look, you clear one of the reasons, actually, like there's so many reasons that I have you on, but one of the reasons I have you on, honestly, is because like I think you're phenomenal, and you
Thank
have
you.
such a powerful like voice and story. Probably because you get your 6 to 7 hours of sleep, you drink your water, you know where your energy comes from, all those things. But also because like I don't know. I want more people to know about your amazingness and awesomeness, and to learn from it. And one of the things that I appreciate most about you, which is why at this moment I have a pro wrestling replica belt hung up behind me specifically for this interview, is you are also a pro wrestling fan. You've been a pro wrestling manager. You work as a WWE announcer. You do all the things. So I have to ask you, Stan, before we like really get into like the conversation of it all, because I'm just having a good time making you do things or say things. How would, like, if you were a wrestling, and you know what I do on the Wrestling RHAP up, and even
Yeah.
at the start of Podfriends, like, if you were a wrestling announcer, how would you introduce yourself? Slash, if you replaced me on the Wrestling RHAP up and I was fired and you and Mari were hosting the podcast, how would you introduce yourself, assuming that you somehow were a guest on your own pod? I don't know. Well,
Now you're really putting me on the spot here, because like
You're
I don't know.
pro.
I haven't really thought about it in quite some time. So for context, here in the Philippines, we're only beginning to go back out into the world again. So like where you guys in the US were at in mid 2021, that's where we're at in mid 2022. All right.
I mean, good
So,
for you.
yeah, it took us
been a journey.
an extra year to like recover and all that. And I say that to add context to why I never got back into the Philippine wrestling scene, because like before COVID hit, I was part of the independent scene here, and I would go out and I would get introduced, and
Yeah.
even at the time I didn't know how I wanted to get introduced, because to me the most important thing was I need my music there. Because
Yeah.
in wrestling, music is like half the presentation, right? So I didn't care how they announced my name as long as they pronounced it correctly, but I needed the music to really make an impact. So I remember one of my first entrance themes was an Eminem song called 3 a.m., and it had this really bombastic intro like bam, 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 bam. So it just really hyped me up, and I needed something to hype me up.
Yeah.
And fast forward a couple years later, I actually licensed a song from this DJ in the UK. He just charged us $20. So for like a bunch of independent wrestlers, we were like, hell yeah, let's split this
great.
$20 and get the music right. And I tell this story to say that all I really care about is the music.
Yeah.
I just need to set the mood, make sure that everybody feels as hyped as I do, and then when I go out, you can introduce me however you want.
So wait, I love that you almost tricked me. You kind of like dodged your intro somehow there. Like, how would you introduce yourself, Stan? Of all people, you have to have an intro. Or is that you leave it to me?
Yeah, you can introduce me however you want. A professional storyteller. There, let's keep it concise. A professional storyteller.
Yeah, and you tell all kinds of stories, and I think that that's kind of one of the cool things about you, which is that like there's a range of stories, and I relate so much to you. Obviously, I relate so much to you. Like we connect on so many different levels, whether it's wrestling or identity, or even just like mental health and like navigating like the challenges that come with these types of with the world, I guess, really, right? But yeah, this is so interesting. And I think that the first place that I kind of want to start is maybe like with well, we did start talking about wrestling just a little bit. So something I want to share with you, Stan, is that when I was growing up, like I wanted to be a pro wrestler for a little while. Obviously, of course, like what wrestling fan doesn't as a kid? But I wanted to, and then like around the time when I was 10, I just started watching wrestling by myself because of the video games. By the time I was 10, I saw Hulk Hogan bleeding, and I was like, no, not for me. But then I realized that it wasn't real, and that it was like, it was a work, is what we call it. So it's like, I mean, he was really bleeding, and people are really getting hurt. But obviously, there's kayfabe, which is basically like people are working storylines, and it's pre-rehearsed and predetermined and all these things, but also very dangerous at the same time. And so I was like, maybe I could do this. And then I did a youth wrestling clinic. I don't know if you knew this about me, but I threw some drop kicks, did some bumps, and I said, you know what? I don't know, but I could be a manager. And so I'm very jealous that you had the wrestling manager experience. But like for the people that are not wrestling fans, who I'm not going to say don't give a shit, but who don't care about wrestling, like what is that weird experience? What does it mean to be a wrestling manager? And then how does it relate to like the other things that you do or, kind of have in your bio essentially?
Sure. Well, I'm going to take a page out of The Masked Man or David Shoemaker from The Ringer. If you don't listen to wrestling, or if you don't watch wrestling, thanks for listening to this podcast. Like you, I did start watching wrestling as a kid. I was 14 or 13 when I got into it. But what really caught my eyes and my ears wasn't necessarily the action. It was the mic work. People getting in the ring and delivering these monologues. In wrestling, we call them promos. And then the commentators, the announcers, like when they would put on their headsets and they would be basically the soundtrack to the shows. And they would tell the stories of each match, each segment, the show as a whole. It just fascinated me. Like, I knew that I wanted to get involved in wrestling, but not as any of those athletes, because when you're a kid, you can kind of figure out early on if you're athletic or not. And I'm not athletic. I'm tall, I'm lanky, not coordinated at all. So I know my strengths and my weaknesses. I knew I could talk. So I was like, okay, maybe I could find my way in if I knew how to talk, right? Fast forward about a decade later, the Philippine wrestling scene started to pick up again. And I started to attend their shows. And I was like, okay, these guys know what they're doing in the ring, I guess. But nobody really knew how to talk just yet. There was just like one or two guys. And then a few months into covering their shows on our podcast, which was in its infancy as well at the time, I sat down with the then president of the indie wrestling promotion in the country, and he was like, how do you like to get involved with us? And I'm like, yeah, sure. What did you have in mind? Because I can't wrestle. And I had no ambitions of getting in the ring because at the time, I was an aspiring TV host as well.
Yeah.
I was attending these auditions and these go-sees, kept getting all these rejections. But I figured I would have a better shot at actually getting my foot in the door if I was on both feet and not on crutches. I didn't want to risk getting any injuries whatsoever. So I was like, career-wise, it would be a better idea if I got involved, but not in a physical capacity, right? So we have the conversation, and he goes, we want you to be the general manager of the promotion. And I was like, okay, I think I can do that. Can I wear my suits and do I get my own entrance music? And as soon as they said yes, I was like, sign me the F up. So that's really how it started for me. And just being the general manager, if you don't watch wrestling, it's basically the boss of the company. Like you go out, you make matches, you'll be like, oh, Matt Scott, you have an issue with this wrestler. All right, you're going to get in the ring in the main event, and you're going to go one-on-one.
Chappelle.
Chappelle and Matt Scott, you get to go one-on-one for the title tonight right here in Insert City here. So that was basically the job, right? And over time, the character developed, and I was thinking of ways to really maximize my presence there. And when I outgrew the role of the boss, because it's an ongoing story that takes years to play out. I outgrew the role, and one of the guys who was writing the shows was like, "What if you become a villain?" What if you manage your own wrestlers, as in you act like their agent and you get to piss people off? I was like, I'd love to. I'd love to do that because I'm a tall guy. I also like to think I dress well. So that makes me hateable right off the bat because I come across as elitist when I dress well. When everybody's in their, a normal wrestling t-shirt and their jeans, and I come in my suits, I get all high and mighty. I also tend to look snobbish and standoffish in real life because I'm not the extroverted type to like go out and meet friends with everybody left and right. So taking all of these things I know about how I carry myself, I was like, I think I'd be a good villain. Plus, I have all this baggage that I could channel out into these vitriolic monologues in front of people when I'm in the ring. So basically, if you don't watch wrestling, a wrestling manager, their job is to make you hate the wrestler that they're with. They're supposed to rile people up, and they're supposed to get the attention of the referee so that the villainous wrestler or the heel can cheat, can do all these dirty tactics. You're supposed to be what we call in the business a heat magnet, because you're the magnet for all the hate from the crowd. So having to learn all that was a nice little evolution that I got to do for the last couple of years in my run in the Philippines.
Wow. And it's interesting because, like, thinking about it, wrestling is very interesting in terms of how people perceive it, and a lot of people have preconceptions. But like at the end of the day, what you're talking about is really theater and it's characters, and it's like
absolutely,
and it's this thing that I think a lot of us who appreciate media and like watching these shows could take in. Like when you're watching a show like Big Brother, for instance, which so many of us are doing this summer, and every summer, for better or for worse, is that there's always like the over the top characters. And, I always like, even in this live reality game that I'm part of, Survivor Philadelphia, I am like so over the top in so many of my reactions. And I've explained to people, I'm like, part of that's sometimes being surprised, but most of it is like selling. In pro wrestling, you're selling, and what that means is like you are you're just reacting really, and like really giving credibility to whatever I'll say like whatever the acting is, or whatever the action is, that is not like someone actually kicking you in the face, or it's not someone actually insulting you and your character, or you and your being. It's like someone saying the lines that are directed toward your gimmick or your character. And so there's so much there that I think is really powerful. But I also think more broadly, like, it's cool that you are able to like use your voice in so many different ways. And I'm like just curious to like go back, and we'll work our way more through your career and everything else. But like, where did your kind of like your passion for being this bombastic person on the mic who's going to be the heel sometimes, or maybe even like the baby face, the good guy sometimes, where did that even begin? Because I know as a kid, for me, like that wasn't me. That's more of me now. Like I could be the general manager at the wrestling promotion now and call people out on the mic and do it all and all the things. But, like, where did that begin for you? Because you do a lot of cool things, as I've kind of established over the last 15 minutes or so.
So I'm a frustrated theater kid. Like growing up, I always wanted to be involved with theater productions, just watch stage plays and all that. But I never got to because, one, my parents were strict. So when school was out, I had to go home. Couldn't stay for like a lot of these extracurriculars.
Yeah.
Second, I come from a very strict traditional Chinese Filipino background where nobody really gives a crap about the arts. Like that's the bluntest way I can put it. Anything artsy, anything media related, not exactly up high on the priority list. So growing up, I had these friends who knew all these musicals from like Phantom of the Opera or Rent and all these things. And I couldn't relate. So for a long time, I was so resentful. Like I wanted to be part of this group, but I couldn't be part of this group because I couldn't relate. I'd never seen Rent. Whenever Seasons of Love would come on, they go 525,000. I would just hate it. I detested the song growing up because it was a reminder of me wanting to be one of them, but I couldn't be part of them because I'd never seen any of these shows.
Yeah.
So it wasn't until I got involved with wrestling that I got to harness that theater kid in me because, like you said, it's character work. It's putting yourself out there, expressing yourself physically, verbally, adding nuance into the things that you do. Even costume design, taking
Yeah.
advantage of certain colors, all of these things that really draw its roots from theater. And, now that I'm an adult and I can afford to, buy a couple of tickets here and there to like stage plays and shit. So, sorry.
Yeah.
I can?
Yeah, you can curse however much.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's
A
early.
lot of people ask, and I'm like, yeah, duh, you could fucking curse.
All right, I'll go
I'm
ahead
just
then.
like, I'm just like, until
turn off the
someone
filter.
tells me not to. Until someone tells me not to.
Gotcha.
It's okay. Yeah.
Anyway, going back, now that I have my own money, I can afford to go see a stage production if I choose to do so. Like when I was in the US for WrestleMania, it just so happened to be in New York, so I caught Hamilton just because I could. So it's me just taking care of my inner child and compensating for all these things that I never got to experience growing up. So I guess just to bring it back to your question, like where did this all come from? Like me wanting to be expressive, to be on the mic, to be a voice actor, to be involved with wrestling.
Yeah.
I think it stems from a love for theater as a kid that I never got to fully explore.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Stan, like even building. There we go. Building on that, Stan, I want to ask. So something that I'm curious about, or curious for you to kind of speak about. So you're just as more context. I'm so curious, like how you grew up, like where you grew up, what that was like exactly, because there's so much like I think there's so much in what you're saying because there is like the aspect of like being Chinoy, right? But then I think like what you're saying is so relatable even to me as someone like who grew up just outside of New York City, and I'm like, oh yeah, I didn't relate to those things. And like 525, I'm like, stop, I'm not on board with that right now. I mean, sometimes I have been, but other times like I'm not caught up on these things. And so like, could you give more context in terms of like how you grew up? Because I think it's even more notable when you consider like I think of identity as being something that brings us together, but also sometimes separates us at times. And, there's that balance. But I don't like, yeah, I'm just like curious what your identity and how you grew up looked, especially contrasted with like those around you, who I'm assuming maybe there weren't a ton of people who are Chinoy, but you could clarify for me.
Sure. So I grew up in a very insulated Chinese-Filipino community. Like, I went to school with fellow Chinoys or fellow Chinese Filipinos. And when I say that, we're basically Filipinos of Chinese ethnicity. So I am a fourth-generation Chinese in the Philippines, which means that it was my great-grandfather who immigrated here from China. My grandfather, my parents, and of course, our generation, we all were born and raised here in the Philippines. So we are as Filipino as the next person. But at the same time, the Chinese Filipino community or the Chinoy community is also very insular. We like to keep to ourselves, and we like to we have our own schools, we have our own events, family associations, and all of that stuff. Just because the community has retained a lot of the immigrant mentality. And
Yeah.
I think this is something that immigrants in the U.S. or in other countries can also relate to as well, where you immigrate to another place and you don't really have much of a support system, so you stick with people of the same ethnicity, people of the same race. In that same vein, the immigrant mentality that got passed down to the Chinese community here in the Philippines is you have to keep working. You have to make sure that you keep working 6 or 7 days a week because you have no one else to fall back on if shit hits the fan. Right?
Yeah.
Like if you go bankrupt, there's nobody to bail you out because you have no other relatives but your own.
Yeah.
So that mentality from the first generation of immigrants got passed on to the second generation, got passed on to the third generation, to the fourth generation, and
Wow,
so
yeah.
on. And that kind of adds context to the thing I mentioned earlier about, we have no time for the arts. We have no time for media. You got to grow up and be a successful engineer or doctor or lawyer or whatever profession where you actually have a certification, because the older generations valued those more aside from having your own business and anything else. Like you want to be an actor, you want to be a radio DJ, you want to get into wrestling. What the fuck?
Yeah.
Like that's been the general reaction.
Yeah.
So a lot of it comes from the immigrant mentality, really, which my generation, at least for someone like me who's a bit more outspoken than the others, I try to use my platform to say things like, dude, it's okay to take a break. You want to go on leave, take a 2-week vacation and go travel? Like, there's nothing wrong with that. Or you want to you want to go against convention and not take on the family business, even if you're the firstborn male. And conventionally in Asian cultures, the business does get passed on to the firstborn male, rather. It's okay if you want to go take a divergent path. So these are the things that I try to speak on, just because for some other people, they're like, no, that idea doesn't exist. And I'm like, dude, the concept is right there. You can go out and just take the other path just because you want to.
Wow. This is deep. This is deep. And we're going places because, like, there's the one thing I think is just so fascinating as like someone who interviews a lot of people and people of like different backgrounds and like in the US context, a lot of immigrants even who come from different places. Like and actually I was having this conversation with my mom, who's also an immigrant to the US, like that we like it's so interesting how so many different cultures and also like the generation before ours, I'd say, or the generations before us have this expectation of like us, and thankfully I didn't have this put on me, but you know, have this expectation of being like doctors or lawyers or engineers or having like PhDs or whatever it might be, but like not being an academic, because that's also maybe not a career that they consider, right? And so it's like, it's just fascinating how like limited the number of careers are, and how like even across cultures there's this consistent value on those certain types of careers. But you obviously went into your own path, like me, became a storyteller. Like, what was your path to that? Because I always say, like, you can't be what you can't see. Obviously, you could see being a storyteller out there, but that was something that was obviously not going to be the most well received, Stan. And so you did it anyway. What was that path to what you wanted to do? And then I also wonder, did you have pit stops along the way, like trying to force yourself to do anything else?
So when I was in high school, I knew I wanted to talk. And there was a part of me that wanted to be a lawyer, because that was my dad's unfulfilled goal. He got into law school, and then after 2 years, he had to drop out because he was already a family man. I was already alive. And he was like, I got to provide for my family. So he prioritized that naturally. So at some point, I wanted to be a lawyer because it was my dad's unfulfilled goal. And then I realized in 11th grade or third year high school here in the Philippines that it wasn't necessarily where I wanted to go. I attended this career talk for law school, and this old lawyer, like in his 50s, now I sound like an asshole. Anyway, this lawyer goes up on stage and goes,
this old decrepit lawyer,
later days,
cobwebs, later days, yes.
This lawyer says, in law school, you will read 100 pages a day. And I was like, fuck that. I'm not going to do this anymore. Hopped on over to the next career talk, which was by the radio DJs I grew up listening to. Like, they happened to be invited to our school. And I was like, man, that's what I want to do. I was so enamored by all their stories about radio life. So right then and there, I knew I wanted to be in a radio station behind the mic. But I didn't know what course I had to take to get there. The following school year, senior year, my friend's older brother gave a talk to sell our university, which is UP, or University of the Philippines, where I went to for college. And he spoke so well. He was such a showman on stage, didn't need a script, didn't need cue cards and all that jazz. So I asked my friend, yo, what course did he sign up for? And he was like, broadcast communication. I'm like, I'm there. So I wrote it down on the form, broadcast communication, got accepted, went in, and I was just so one-track minded that I knew I had to follow these courses to get into radio. Not long into college, I got into radio, so I was balancing that with my studies. And I also knew I wanted to get into sportscasting. So I was trying to get into all these courses where I would just have so much general knowledge, I could incorporate them into things I wanted to talk about. But somewhere along the way, I also knew that being in radio wouldn't pay well. I have no idea what it's like in the US because I've never been a radio personality in the US. But here in the Philippines, oftentimes you need a second, third, fourth, fifth job just to live comfortably with the salary of a radio personality. So my mom knew that, even though she had never been in radio, and that's why there was a bit of disappointment on her end. It was my dad who was actually supportive. Like, my dad is a stage dad in every sense of the word, for better or worse. Like, super supportive since day one. But my mom wasn't. So she wanted me to apply to a bank because my mom is a banker. She was like, "Oh, you should apply for like corporate communications or whatever." And I'm like, not really my cup of tea." So I ended up getting my first job in radio, and I figured, okay, I guess I have some time. Let me apply for a job. So I worked at a nonprofit. There's this nonprofit here in the Philippines called Teach for the Philippines. It's our counterpart for Teach for America.
Right.
So I actually helped start that up here in the Philippines. I worked as their PR guy for about a year. So I did that along with radio. So I guess in terms of detours, that's one of the detours. Another detour I did was I was a social media manager for the E Network here in the Philippines. So like at the height of Total Divas, I was promoting that stuff on the E Philippines social media. I was giving away Divas Championship belts. So it was a great way to integrate my connection to the wrestling community. Another detour I did was I started getting into voice work. Like, I started to learn how to act for commercials. I got this job as the imaging voice for a radio station in Dubai, in the UAE, that catered to the Filipino market because Dubai has a very strong Filipino population. So it's so big over there that they actually got to put on a Filipino radio station where they broadcast in our language, Tagalog.
Wait,
So
what's an imaging voice?
An imaging voice or a continuity announcer is the person who tells you what station you're listening to. So you know those stingers or those sound effects? There has to be a voice behind that, right? So kind of like how in the Chizzy for Shannon and Mike's podcast. So like that voice, that's your imaging voice.
You're listening to Pod Friends.
Yes. Basically.
Now back to
so that's
you,
an imaging voice. So I learned how to do that stuff early on. I sucked, got fired within 3 months because I had a long way to go in terms of learning. Shit happens. I just wasn't up to par at the time. Yeah. So those are some of the detours I went through. But all the while, all through it all, radio never left. Like I was always involved with the radio industry in some way, form, or fashion. But as I was doing all these things, I realized that there's a lot of money to be made in voiceover, just because it's the more lucrative industry, which happened to be ancillary to radio. So I sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, I decided to put more effort into it. Like, I would come in, do my radio show, and then afterwards I'd run to a studio and like record commercials and stuff, which I realize is actually a lot of fun because yes, you're selling products like soap, or a fast food chain, or a telco service. But there's something fun about getting into character and just making love to the mic. And I say that with so much jest because that's essentially what we do when we're in the booth. Like, we make love to that mic and just act our hearts out. And I used to think it was so cheesy when my coaches would say, you have to really feel like you're an actor. And now I get
really
it. Like,
feel the mic. Like, really you have to
feel it.
make love to it. Yeah.
I mean, be conscious of like your distance to it. Be physical with how you act.
It's real.
Yeah. So it goes back to the theater roots that I talked to you about earlier, right?
Yeah.
I'm able to channel that in a studio where, let's say, the role calls for me to be this gritty announcer where I have to have a rasp and I have to sound like I'm a chain smoker just so I can give you that futuristic edge to your commercial.
Oh my gosh. And I'll say, if you're listening to audio only, this must be an experience because I'm just closing my eyes as I sit here, just like really feeling like, whoa, this is intense. Stan, are there other, like, not to cut you off, but are there other like voices like that you have that you've turned to? Because I'm sure you have like a versatility in like, okay, sometimes going with the gritty voice, sometimes I'm going with the ASMR voice. voice? Like what is your obviously you have range there, but can you give us like some samples? Give me some samples
Yeah.
for free?
So my default, which is how I'm talking right now,
Yeah.
is the according to the commercial files, it's the normal conversational everyman voice. Like I've actually been typecast as that voice. All right. So like when I do my imaging work for a
Yeah.
local cable network, that's the voice. This other client I have in the U.S., they also want me to speak like this. So this is the voice when I'm selling. Go check out the summer specials over at Counter 7. It's available until August 31, 2022. So like that's the normal announcer conversational voice. I recently learned that I could sound younger, or that I can sound younger if I channeled it. So I learned this when I played Yule from Don't Look Up, the guy played by Timothy Chalamet.
Yeah,
So
I was
Timothy
gonna
Chalamet, obviously younger.
Yeah.
Obviously a younger guy, I had to be his character, but in Tagalog, in Filipino. So what I did was I listened to him speak, and then I hiked up my voice a little bit so I can sound a little bit younger. And I'd be like, oh man, I fucking love chicken fingerlings. So it's
the
just a
line?
little bit. That was actually a line which I had to say in the Tagalog version. So that wasn't like I fucking love chicken fingerlings. So I had to do that. There was another time where I had to sound like Randall Park.
Yeah.
So if you've seen Randall Park,
Yeah.
Apparently we have the same vocal register. So I just had to be a little bit more nasal with my delivery so I can sound like Randall Park.
Wow, this is interesting, and I'm glad you addressed. I was going to ask what it felt like, and you know what? I am curious a little bit more about what it felt like to for you to play Timothy Chalamet on Netflix. But there's so much that you've done too, that you've accomplished too within your voice work. I feel like there's probably even more you had to share about your path. But I'm just to stop in on that. You were on Netflix. You are on Netflix as Timothy Chalamet. In my book, I don't care about the character. You are Timothy Chalamet, and no one else has ever played. I mean, maybe the other voice actors for other languages have, but you are on Netflix as him, as his voice. Like, what does that even feel? Or even like Randall Park? Like, what does that even feel like? Because that's kind of wild. Like, I couldn't imagine watching someone and then it's my voice coming out of their mouth.
It's really trippy. Like when Don't Look Up's Tagalog audio came out on Netflix, I made sure to watch it so I could hear myself. And yeah, it is weird. Like the jarringness, if that's a word, of it all never leaves you. Funnily enough, one of the things I kept listening to on Rewind on Netflix wasn't my lines as Yule or as Timothy Chalamet, but as one of my lines as this old congressman who was supposed to lampoon like the right-wing sector of it all. Like there was, if you're familiar with Don't Look Up's plot, right, it really lampoons the U.S. political arena.
Yes.
So there was this one congressman who is, I would say, in his 50s or 60s and really conservative. So I had to learn the nuances of talking like somebody older and somebody more conservative in their leanings. So I had to watch the scene and I had to break it down. And the director, who's also one of my mentors, was like, are you listening? He has a gruffer voice. He speaks more slowly. You have to emulate that because you are a young person. You talk with so much energy. You have to pull that back. So I listened and I was like, how are you sure that this person is really speaking the truth? I mean, the comet was named right after them. So I had to make my voice a bit gruffer, around the edges, and speak much more slowly and much more pronounced.
Oh my gosh. This is all like so interesting though too, just because it speaks to beyond the wonderful talent that is your voice. Like there's so much here too that's also like the layer of the cultural aspect of like, okay, let's literally translating into Tagalog, but also just like translating like US culture to other cultures in some ways. Like I don't know, but it's funny because I just feel like that's an extra layer, an extra thing to think about on top of all of the things that you think about. But like, what's that experience like? And has Timothy Chalamet sent you any thank you cards for doing such a wonderful job?
Oh fuck no! I doubt he knows I exist. So, but
You need to change that.
them's
Yeah.
the breaks in this industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
in terms of your question regarding
Mhm.
American culture and how that translates, I would say that here in the Philippines, we have a general awareness of American culture just because American television is so prevalent here. Like
Mhm.
growing up as somebody who was relatively privileged, I had access to cable TV. And what that meant was I grew up watching Cartoon Network,
Mhm.
Nickelodeon, Disney Channel. I grew up with Lizzie McGuire and even
Yeah.
Stevens and
Mhm.
the Ren and Stimpy show. So like all of these things, like Keenan and Kel, like I'm
Yeah.
very well aware of them. But there were some things that I wasn't as aware of growing up. For example, dialogue about racism. I wasn't so
Mm.
aware at the time, right? Just because, for one, those conversations were different 20 years ago than they
Yeah.
are right now. But second, of course, here in the Philippines, we have different social issues that the level of racism in America wasn't something that we immediately knew right off the bat. But in terms of American culture, we knew pop culture, we knew what was going on, which is why it was so easy for us to latch on to American things like reality TV. Like when Survivor was big in the was at its peak in mainstream American pop culture in the early 2000s, it was
Mhm.
kind of right around at the same level here, to the
Yeah.
point that about a decade later, there was a Philippine franchise of Survivor as well. So when I
Mhm.
was watching all of these American shows growing up, from the WWE to the shows on Nickelodeon and the Disney Channel, I always struggled with the fact that I couldn't find anybody who resembled me. Like
Mhm.
the closest avatars I could find were American Dragon Jake Long on Disney Channel, if you ever watched
Yeah.
that, or when Survivor came on and I saw Xian Huang, because
Yeah.
she was the first Asian American contestant, right? Or Daniel
Mhm.
Liu the following season on the
Yeah.
Amazon. I'll never forget that scene
Uh,
where Matthew Von Ertfelde and Daniel Liu were conversing in Mandarin. That really spoke to me, just because finally I feel represented here on TV, right? So
yeah.
those little things meant so much to me growing up, just because it was always just white people on TV, for lack of a
Yeah.
better term. I never could find really an Asian American avatar that I could identify with. For example, in Survivor, until Yul Kwan came along and really epitomized the type of player I loved to see on TV.
Mm.
In terms of, say, wrestling, I didn't really. I mean, like, Batista and I don't look anything alike. So even if Batista is Filipino, I couldn't exactly claim Batista as my guy 100%. You get what I mean?
Right. Yeah.
In the NBA, which I followed, Yao Ming was my first favorite player because he's Chinese,
You are
but
tall.
and I am tall, right? But like, he wasn't Filipino Chinese or Chinese Filipino, so like I couldn't
Yeah.
100% relate to Yao Ming either. So there was that struggle with me finding somebody that would represent me, even in radio. Nobody was identifying as a Chinese Filipino. Everybody just tried to sound American, and
Yeah.
everybody would just try to be like, I'm just like every one of you.
Yeah. 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 And it reminds me a lot of like even something that I find frustrating is I'll call it like NPR voice. And I don't have any problems with NPR. Like I have a lot of actually I know a lot of people who've worked there. I have a close friend who spent a lot of time there. And there's like it's like it's basically like erasing all of the markers of identity or of uniqueness from your voice that might like add character to it or add personality. It's like, let's try to sound formulaic and the same in a lot of ways. And that goes for a lot of types of broadcasting, like broadcast news. And I especially notice it when I if and when I watch or listen to like local news, because I'm like, why does this person in Texas sound like they're from NPR or where whatever like it might be? But like
So
it's always
basically,
just
their accent got washed away.
yeah, and I'm just like, why does the industry feel the need to do this to erase people's identities? And then something I also think about when you were talking through all that is also just the importance of identity. And I mean, like we are both people who care about representation and identity. At the same time, there are also many people who don't care about that, who are, Black or Chinoy or who like whatever their identity might be. So, like, why do you think it was so? One, do you think that this is something that like everyone cares about, or if not, like, why did you think that this is something that jumped out to you especially? Have you ever figured that out? Because I think I'm still asking myself that question in some ways.
I think I'm on the same boat as you are. Like, I haven't
Yeah.
fully figured it out yet. And on the question of importance, I think it depends on you as a person. It's a case-to-case
Yeah.
basis. Like, I can't force it on you, Matt. Like, Matt, you got to care about this shit as much as I do, man. Like, I
Right,
can't do
yeah.
that, right?
And
Like, that's
yeah,
an unbelievable
yeah,
ask,
yeah,
right? But I guess I just feel like it's always been important to me in the sense that it would be nice to see or hear someone like me out there. I'm a media consumer at heart. You know,
Yeah.
I watch movies, I listen to the radio, I listen to podcasts, I watch TV. And every time someone like me gets represented out there, it lets me know I exist. In a way, it lets me know that I'm important, that I am also a market worth being catered to. Like, I don't know if you caught Spider-Man No Way Home, but one of the characters there, Ned, Spider-Man's best friend, he's
Yeah.
Filipino. And he has a Filipino grandma who ends up appearing on screen and speaks in Tagalog all throughout. And I had friends who were complaining, like, that Tagalog wasn't even crisp enough, it wasn't fluent enough, that actor was clearly just Filipino-American, not a
Yeah.
pure Filipino. And I'm like, stop, like, we're being
Yeah.
represented in the fucking MCU. Like, that's a big freaking deal right
Yeah.
there. And I'm going to take this W for what it is, and
Yeah.
I'll improve it later on. Like, the fact that our language is being heard in this multi-billion-dollar global franchise
Yeah.
is a big deal because it speaks to me, literally. And it tells
Yeah.
me that our people exist within their universe as well. So I guess that's a long-winded way of explaining why I care about this so much.
Yeah, and it's right, and it's like it's not like perfect is the enemy of the good sometimes, right? Like we want things to be perfect to be a certain way, but it's like progress is so important, and it's important that we take those steps to be more represented, but also provide more representation for people, is the thing that I think about a lot. Setting the stage a little bit more and kind of connecting the dots between identity and some of what you've talked about already in your career. I love your podcast, On Deck with Stan C. I love it. I love it. I appreciate like the interview conversations that you've had with many people, including the one and only Rob Sesternino. Check that out, people. But also,
Thank you.
I think more than that, though, no shade, Rob, but more than that, I love like when it's just you talking to the mic about your experiences and a number of topics. Like off the top of my head, mental health is a big one that comes up, politics, and how you decided to like bring more politics into your voice as a radio DJ, in a world where people really want to like be uniform and kind of fall in line. You talking about these things is huge. Like it's it matters because it gives other people the space to do it, but also I can imagine it's a scary or vulnerable thing to do. Like the stigma against mental health is not as bad I mean, it's getting better over time. Like I don't think it's getting worse, but at the same time, it's difficult when you talk about these things in a public profession when someone else is a gatekeeper, could hire you, fire you, hate you, whatever it might be, because of those like choices to speak about those things that are so important. So like, how did you make that choice to speak up about the topics that you talk about? And maybe you could even you set up a little before even like diving into why, could you set up like when you think of On Deck with Stan C, and even like about now steaming a Chinoy podcast, like how would you kind of sum up what it is and the purpose, and like how do you find, I don't know, but I'd call it like the bravery in some ways to actually do like use your voice for those things?
So for starters, On Deck was a pandemic passion project. And the running joke on the pod is, for as long as the pandemic exists, this podcast will continue to run. And the pandemic's not over, so I guess the podcast is still
for
around.
this one reason. This is the one reason we're happy it keeps going.
Not saying that we're thankful for the pandemic at all. Not saying
No,
No.
No.
The COVID sucks. Fuck COVID.
Of course, is horrible. It's also horrible to have it. It's horrible. There's things have been so horrible with it,
Mhm.
but you have been making this beautiful silver lining out of things with the podcasts, and so
Yeah.
go on.
Kind of like what you're doing with Pod Friends. On Deck was supposed to be just peeling back the curtain on the radio industry and me just talking to people. When I was thinking or when I was conceptualizing the podcast, RHAP was obviously an inspiration from the many interviews that Rob has had. Talk is Jericho is also an inspiration because I loved listening to Chris Jericho's interviews with other wrestlers and them just breaking down their characters and talking about the industry as a whole. And I wanted to bring that for the radio industry in the Philippines, where radio DJs are commonly masked figures, like especially the older generations. Like people don't know how they look like, because back in the day there was no social media, there was no live streaming, there was no Twitch for people to see who was behind the booth. And second, a lot of them used stage names. Air names, right? So it would be nice to like peel back that curtain and ask them, how did you come up with that handle? What was it like being a radio DJ at the peak of FM radio in the Philippines in the 90s and the 2000s? Stuff like that. And as a geek, as a nerd for the radio industry, it was also very self-serving in that sense. Like I get to talk to these people that I've always wanted to meet, and here's a convenient excuse to get to ask them questions. So it was that, and then about a couple years into the podcast, I realized that I had some unfinished business with the radio industry here because to provide the backstory, I got furloughed from my last radio station because of the pandemic, because FM radio got hit pretty hard as an industry. And I thought I was fine. I'd bounced back pretty quickly because not long after I got furloughed, I got another pair of jobs based in the US, WWE happened and all that.
Yes.
So it wasn't like I needed to get back on radio for money. But like as somebody who loved the industry, I kind of felt like the industry didn't show me the same love back. So there was that bitterness. I think of Eminem's song Spacebound, where he just raps about how he loved hip hop and hip hop never showed him that love back. And that's exactly how I felt. And so I figured season 4, I'm probably just going to be reflecting on my own story. I mean, it's my podcast. Nobody can tell me what to talk about, what not to talk about. So that question you had about opening myself up with a conversation on politics or mental health, technically there was nobody to filter me. There was no station manager breathing down my neck telling me, Stan, you can't talk about this. Stan, you can't say those words. So I felt like I had carte blanche to talk about myself. So I decided to just write stuff down on a Word document, turn on the mic, and I just spitballed for about 20 minutes about why I was no longer on the air. And for some reason, that one episode resonated with people, even though at its core, it was just me bitching about how bitter I was that, I'd been furloughed and the rug had been pulled from underneath me. So ever since then, I started to dig into my thoughts as somebody with a mic, and just trying to connect with people on an individual level, because I know I'll never be a celebrity on the level of like a Casey Kasem or a Ryan Seacrest.
Or
I'm
Rob
never gonna be on that level.
Sesternino.
Sure, yeah, or Rob Sesternino, right? But I think there is some value in being an individual who's able to say these things, because sometimes the celebrities won't allow themselves to be vulnerable enough to say these things, if that makes sense. And that's what I did. That's what I've been doing. Even with that other podcast now steaming, it's me reflecting on my identity as a Chinoy. With my other friends, we're also wrestling with that identity. We're all in our 30s. We're all trying to figure out like where we stand here in the Philippines. Which parts of our tradition and culture are archaic? Which ones are the ones that should be left in the past? Which ones can we cling on to here in the year of our Lord 2022. So it's all about being authentic and just telling your story.
Yeah, I want to actually dig into that a little bit, because I think a lot of us actually, a lot of people who are podcasters, but even maybe like podcast listeners, maybe I think it's hard to appreciate this as a podcast listener, is that anyone who's just standing in front of a mic and talking to it as like the sole voice. Bryce Isaiah does a wonderful job with this for so much of the Purple Pants podcast on this network, and he has guests on a bunch, but there have been many episodes and many moments where it's just him kind of talking, and he's able to make that really compelling and interesting and have a conversation with the people while also sharing something that is so deep and meaningful. Like, I guess from that perspective, like, what is your process? Because it's so compelling to me to like sit down and like synthesize my thoughts on things and then talk on a podcast, almost like as a form of therapy, or like just getting it out there, because people need to hear about these important topics, right? But like, what's your process for actually doing that? If there are people out there who are like, yeah, I would love to make a podcast or make something, like make a YouTube channel or whatever it is, where it's talking about these different topics. I always get like overwhelmed by that type of thing, because I'm like, there's so much you could talk about, but so little time. And who's going to care is like the thing at the end of the day.
That's a very important question, the whole who's going to care kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that still bothers me to this day. And I've been podcasting for 8 years at this point. So from the moment I started my first podcast, I was like, who the fuck is going to listen to a pro wrestling podcast in the Philippines made by these Filipino fans? Little did I know we'd have our own little community 8 years later. But to answer your question on the thought process, I'm glad you mentioned therapy. Because therapy's allowed me to synthesize my thoughts and just write things down. Like, there was a time when I'd go into a therapy session and I would just freestyle. But because I realized that I have 1 hour, I got to make the most out of it, I would take notes. And when I started doing season 4 of On Deck, where I was digging into my own issues with the radio industry, with having been furloughed and all of that stuff, I decided that signposting and having these bullet points will actually help, because it keeps me on track. I tend to go on these tangents, on these side quests, like many podcasters and many radio personalities. It's a sickness that afflicts us all. But one way that keeps me on track is to really just write everything down. And it also guarantees that I have a starting point, a midpoint, and a finish. So it's kind of like writing a match. So when I have my Word document and I'm looking at it, I'm able to map out the journey of the podcast while also looking at the timer in my Adobe Audition. So I'm conscious, like, okay, I'm approaching 15 minutes. I have to kind of wind down here and slow it down with the side quests. So there's that. It helps just monitoring myself. And when I'm actually recording, when I'm not monitoring the time, I honestly imagine that I'm talking to somebody. Like, I close my eyes and I just face the mic and I just emote. Like, I just tell the mic that it really bothers me that there are people who are still in the industry that blah, 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 or that I'm not in the industry because blah, 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 blah. So, that was a lot of the earlier part. But when I started talking about, like, politics and mental health, I would imagine myself just talking to another version of myself and just being empathetic and telling that version of me that I understand where they're coming from, that they can open up to me. And for some reason, people seem to gravitate towards that type of content. Like, I would get these messages on Instagram from people who would say that I checked out your podcast, I appreciated how vulnerable you were in that episode, and I'm like, I'm glad it made an impact on you, because to be very honest, I was just really doing that for me.
Yeah.
So you can call it a happy accident of sorts.
Yeah, but I think that's actually how a lot of the best things really work. Like, something I find even in interviewing people, especially in the context of my full-time work, which is in the climate solutions world. Like, I have the opportunity to like actually sit down with people, like mostly other like people of color in particular, who are like similar. It's a problem of representation everywhere. So like, there's in the climate space, it's a very white space overall, and a lot of the voices represented are like older white men, for instance. And so like, to sit down with someone who is like a young person or like a person of color and like talk with them, I feel like the benefit of it immediately, but then the fact that it's being recorded and then edited into something that could like inspire and inform others is really powerful. And so I relate a lot to you there. And I've always been of the mind, even with interviewing, like, mission accomplished in terms of like interviewing someone and having a great conversation. Like if no one listened to this, Stan, then it's amazing already just that we could have this conversation and that I could like listen back to it. But then there's the added benefit, like the happy accident that you call it, which I guess at the end of the day, kind of happy, it becomes less of a happy accident as you build community. But like people do want to tune in and like learn from it, which actually also brings me to another side of this, where you also have like very similar conversations interviewing people, and I always think that those are really powerful. And I appreciate that I, as someone who does not know Tagalog, could still follow along even through the code switching. I love you I'll say, as like behind the scenes, you always mention to me, you're like, I'm so sorry for all of the code switching. I'm like, no, Stan, this is amazing. I could follow along. I wish that you could code switch with me while we were on the podcast together, but I probably would like almost no sell it. Like, yeah, that makes sense. I know where you're going, but yeah, like you also bring other voices and people in. Like, what's it like for you as an interviewer to bring other people into this like therapeutic bubble that you've created?
I just love the idea that I'm going to say it again. I have an excuse to talk to this person and to that person. Like, one of my favorite interviews from a previous season was when I talked to this woman named Aisha Agkawili. So she was a softcore adult star here in the Philippines in
I
the
listened
2000s.
to this one.
And she also wrote a sex positivity column on our version of FHM for a good number of years. So in the 2000s, our attitudes toward sex, both in the Philippines and in the US, were not the way that they are right now. So, her being very sex positive, her being, I believe she's bisexual, and her being open about it.
Yeah.
A lot of people did say a lot of derogatory things her way. They slut shamed her and all of that stuff, which, looking back, not a good look, Philippines. not a good look, society.
Right.
So I wanted to get in her head and just ask about what it was like to be sex positive and to be so open about it in the 2000s, which was not that long ago, and yet it was a world of difference between that time and right now. So she actually opened up about it. I asked her about her family's reactions to when she got into softcore here in the Philippines, especially at that time. Softcore is basically hardcore here because we're such a Puritan, conservative Catholic country. So it was really cool to get to talk to her and ask about what it was like for her to go on national radio, for example, and have that platform to talk about sex, just because she was already associated with that by virtue of her branding being in adult entertainment. And what that was like writing sex columns on a magazine that was distributed nationally, right, in the 2000s when our attitudes were so different. So it was really cool to ask those questions, and that's something, or that's an opportunity I would not have had if the podcast didn't exist, or like talking to radio legends here in the Philippines.
Yeah.
Like for me, that's always interesting because I get to track their journeys and try to see if there are any parallelisms. What are the things that were prevalent then that aren't prevalent now, stuff like that. Or just really picking their brain on the creative process. Because at that time, in my own radio journey, I was just milked dry out of creativity. I had nothing. Nothing going on. I was operating on just playing music, standard spiels that I'd memorized from years of being on the radio. Nothing creative at all because I was just so out of it. So to hear someone else talk about their creativity was my way of trying to get injected with their own creative juices.
Damn. That's deep, and I think it's powerful. And everything that you kind of laid out there speaks there, like everything we've talked about so far actually speaks to like a shifting culture, shifting generations, like pursuing your passion, going in the direction that you want to go. I have to ask though, Stan, about, well, there are a lot of things I have to ask about, but I want to ask about your experience as a WWE announcer as much as we talk about. But first, as Julie Chen Moonves would say, but first, so radio, you've had a number of experiences within it. But there's one that I don't know how much you've talked about, which is your love for boy bands, which I'm familiar with. but could you talk about this and how this comes up in the context of radio and what you've done? Because I'm aware of this, but I would just like to learn so much more of how this manifested, other than like maybe the generational thing of like, don't we all want it that way, just like the Backstreet Boys? Don't we all just want to say bye bye bye, like in sync? Don't we all just want to, maybe even someone want to be a summer girl, just like LFO was talking, right? So who knows? But tell me, Stan, boy bands, what's up with that? What? Wait. What's up with that?
I like it. I love it. The hurricane reference.
Yes.
If a radio station manager ever talked to me and said, "You can never ever play a boy band song again," that would be the hardest thing I'll ever have to do. So I love boy band music. Like my earliest memories of boy band music are listening to the Backstreet Boys, the Millennium album from 1999 when that came out. I was actually imagining myself as a radio DJ without knowing that I was imagining myself as a radio DJ because I had a cassette tape of Millennium at the time and I would play it on my Walkman. And between I Want It That Way and Show Me the Meaning of Being Lonely, that's tracks 2 and 3, there was like a 7-second gap. And I would try to squeeze in an ad lib like, that's the Backstreet Boys with I Want It That Way. All right, here's their next single coming up now. It's Show Me the Meaning of Being Lonely. So kind of like how you would do it at a radio station. And then right after that, the cold open goes, Show Me the Meaning of Being Lonely, right? So it always just stuck with me that boy band music just made me feel a certain way. It always triggered happy memories. And when I started falling in love, like I would go to boy band music to like channel all of these emotions. So from American boy bands like the Backstreet Boys and NSYNC and 98 Degrees and LFO to British boy bands like Westlife and Take That and One Direction, even to the one-hit wonders like the Menudo revival group called MDO, which had like one single in 2001. I listened to all that shit in my spare time, and it just really makes me feel alive. And I channel that into my radio work when we started playing older music on Thursdays because it's Throwback Thursday. So at this radio station I used to work for, whenever we would do the 90s playlist on a Thursday, I would line up 30 minutes worth of songs at 6 p.m. and I'd just play them all back to back to back, all boy band shit. Like I would call it the boy band set. And I'd always start with a BSB track, like it would be something bombastic like Get Down or Larger Than Life. Then I would segue to like an NSYNC song and we would just go down until I'd close it out with like a one-hit wonder just so I can say I played like 5 or 6 different boy bands all in a row. And I don't know. There's something cheesy about boy band music. It's very bubblegum pop. And for someone like me who, has also worked in stereotypically alpha male spaces like wrestling or a hip hop station, it's very off brand. And yet it's just something that's always been more me. Like, I could never separate it from myself. Like, I guess to bring it back to wrestling, one of my fantasies is to come out to boy band music. Just for shits and giggles. Like, if my entrance theme could have been a song from any of these wonderful boy bands, I would love to see that happen.
Stan, what would you can't leave me hanging like that. What would and maybe you don't have just one that you would choose, but like, what would the theme song potentially be from one of these boy bands? Stan, we have to put it out into the universe because we need to get the licensing and like maybe if AJ from NSYNC or the Backstreet, whichever one he's in. That's exactly. He might be listening.
I'd probably pick As Long As You Love Me by the Backstreet Boys just because I always loved the keyboard at the start. It just really gets you into that.
You love me.
It just gets you into that zone where you want to just be all smooth and shit. Another one that I would pick is It's Gonna Be Me by NSYNC just because, the message speaks for itself, but also the opening notes, the opening riff, just gets your attention. It's kind of like Hit Me Baby One More Time. Like when you hear those notes, right? You know what song that is.
How does the opening riff go of that song? Or what does that sound like?
It's Gonna Be Me?
Yeah.
It goes da-da-da-da-da-da.
Yeah,
It's gonna be da-da-da-da-da-da, right? So like
it's gonna be me.
it's still
Yeah.
kind of wrestling like where you got the hook and
I
people are
like
like, oh
that.
yeah, I know that song. Oh hey, it's the
Mhm.
boy band guy. So there. Yeah, dude, boy band music. It just makes me feel alive. I swear. I can talk about this for hours. Like I created a playlist on Spotify, like my ultimate boy band set, which had over 150 boy band songs from over the years. And I went on a road trip recently. I just had that on. I was calm as shit the entire time.
Wow. Okay. Well, damn, that's a play. Look, we'll talk about where I could find that playlist later. This is amazing though. And it makes me think about, I'm just picturing, and also I'm kind of wondering like what the vision is for where you kind of want to go with things with your career and all. I definitely will make sure to get back to RHAP, but specifically, I'm picturing you at a WWE show at WrestleMania in Washington D.C. in like 5 years. Somehow we'll make that a thing, and you'll be walking out at the start of the show to like it's gonna be me, and I'll be there front row because Mari and I will have finally saved up enough money for front row tickets at WrestleMania. And everyone else will be cheering. Some people will just be getting to their seats. I will be crying front row, taking it in, Stan. But yeah, like what is it even like to work for WWE in the context that you do? I know that you're working from home and doing the work that you're doing, but I'm
Yep.
curious what that's like because a number of years ago, I won like there's someone I know who works for WWE. He's worked there for a long time, and he kind of gave me a tour backstage at like a house show, which is
Damn.
like one of the non-televised shows for people wondering. And we even kind of went out down to the ramp, and I remember meeting a couple of the wrestlers, some who are there, some who aren't. Someone was injured at that point, like while they were training, getting ready for the show. A couple of the wrestlers were like clowning on me and making fun of me for no reason, bullying me in fun ways. We were having a great time, but I would say like I considered like, ooh, maybe I could have a job at this place, doing social media or something like that. I don't know, but like, what is that like to actually be at a place that I'm sure that you envisioned working for in a variety of ways? Just over the course of your life.
So I think I would be such a bullshitter if I said that I
Yeah.
always thought there was a path to get here. Because, like, I live in the Philippines, I have to be real at some point and realize that. The chances of someone like me ending up in this position were so slim, slimmer than
Mhm.
Slim Shady. So, like,
Ooh.
what were the chances that all of this would happen, right? From my earliest memories of watching wrestling and just being enamored with commentary and thinking to myself, oh, I want to get paid to tell these stories about wrestling on
Mhm.
WWE, right? Like, what were the chances? Sometime in the mid 2010s, that was when WWE started coming back here to the Philippines for meet and greet events, for live events and all that. Before then, it was like almost a decade before they last came. So it was a big deal, and I was part of the coverage because by then I was already known in the Philippines as the wrestling guy, like on
Mhm.
the radio, on the internet. I kind of developed a bit of a reputation as the radio DJ who really loves wrestling. So they invited me to cover these events. I got to interview The Big Show, Paul White from AEW. Got to interview him, and I got to meet the general manager of WWE's Asia Pacific office, which was
Yeah.
based in Singapore. So, like, this is the actual general manager and not somebody who goes on TV and makes matches. Like, he actually works in corporate.
Not a
Just for,
character, like real
yeah,
person doing
like
jobs
a
with
real person
paper.
doing real
Yes.
corporate work, right?
Yes.
So his name's Chris Marsh. He doesn't work there anymore, but
Mm.
Chris and I we got connected. I wanted to pitch our local wrestling scene as a talent pool he could dip into if ever he needed Southeast Asian wrestlers. I was like,
Yeah.
the Philippines has these local talent. You could bring them over there, and it would be great for us because we could learn from you guys, right? So we had the meeting, and then somewhere along the way, I also pitched myself as an events host. I was like, if ever you need an events host for your live events, I'm someone you don't even have to train. Like, I watch your product religiously in terms of product knowledge, the branding, and all of that. I'm very familiar, and for some reason he remembered it. And 2 years later, when Xavier Woods of the New Day came over and did a live event, I was the first person they called. They were like, "Would you like to host the event?" And I'm like, "Fuck yeah!" So
Wow.
we negotiated, and I met them, and I was like, "Do I have to submit my questions for Woods for the event to you guys for approval?" And they said to me, "Stan, we know you by now. We know we can trust you to know what to ask and what not to ask, what to say, what not to say. You
Yeah.
got carte blanche, bud." And I'm like, "Sure, let's go do this. Let's have fun." And there's a fine line between having actual carte blanche and getting, putting your foot in your mouth and having carte blanche responsibly. And I'd like to think I towed that line very well. From then on, I stayed in touch with them. I tried to apply as well for a job in the actual regional office in Singapore. And I was like, fuck it, I'll take a corporate job.
Yeah.
I'd love to work
Ooh.
for WWE somehow, some way. And it just didn't happen because they only had like a team of 5, and they had no room for a 6th. So I'm okay,
Yeah.
sure. I'm going to stay here. Fast forward to when the pandemic hit and remote broadcasts were becoming more common. Somewhere along the way, WWE decided that they wanted to bring in the Tagalog audio. So they wanted to have Filipino announcers actually broadcasting the WWE in Tagalog, which is the most spoken language here in the Philippines. I don't know if I've told you this story, but I was watching a documentary on Vice featuring China, the late, great Hall of
Yeah.
Famer. And there was a particular scene in the China Vice documentary where China and her manager were trying to enter WWE headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut. And the camera was literally showing the point of view of somebody entering the door. And I
Yeah.
shit you not, that very moment, I got a text on WhatsApp from a Connecticut number.
Wow.
And that text was the executive who would end up being my boss. He was
Yeah.
like, "I'm blah, blah, blah from WWE. Would you be interested in an opportunity to be an announcer?" And I was like, this is very weird. Like, I'm literally looking at the entrance to headquarters, and I'm also getting a text from a Connecticut number.
Ooh, it gives me chills just thinking about it.
So it's kismet, right? I think
Yeah.
that's the word. It's so weird. I don't really believe in kismet, but I believe in the universe and how the universe conspires and all that. So it was so weird. Anyway, fast forward a few days, did an interview, did an audition. They sent me a couple of clips from WWE's recent shows, and I just had to do voiceover for them in Tagalog. And not long after that, I got a call, and they told me that I got the job. And I was like, "Oh shit! What a roller coaster of emotions!" Because that was the same day that we laid my grandmother to rest, and
Wow.
she was interred in L.A. where she lived. So I was there virtually. I attended that funeral over Zoom, which is like the worst experience ever. Like,
In the
imagine being so-
pandemic, right? Yeah.
at the height of the pandemic, right? Imagine the worst day of your life because I was so close to my grandmother, going through that horrible experience, and then the very next morning you get that call, which literally changes your life.
Yeah.
So that call happens. My first phone call is my mom, and my mom was at the bank, and like within minutes of me telling her that I got the job, she starts blubbering on the phone.
Yeah.
Like, she starts crying. She's a mess. And I'm telling you the story because my mom was always the person who was a bit skeptical about my career choices. It came from a place of love, but it also came from a place of her having grown up not being very affluent. She didn't have a lot growing up. So to her, stability and security would trump everything else.
Yeah.
And knowing how my career, being in media, being in entertainment, is far from stable, far from secure, it always made her doubt whether I was doing the right thing or not. And for her to finally see that, this big company in the U.S., this global company, would look to the Philippines, and that there were 2 seats, exactly just 2 seats at that table, and out of 100 million people, I got one of those seats. I think it blew her mind, and I
Yeah.
think she was like, "Fuck!" Like, it finally happened for him. So that's a very special moment for me. The fact that all came together, and in the almost 1 year since I signed with them, it's been nothing short of a wonderful experience, to be very honest. Like, I literally get to live my dream of telling these stories and being part of the product, and knowing that my voice is right there on the WWE network, which, again, not a lot of people can say that. And to get paid for that, man, like, it's like
Yeah.
I hit the jackpot here.
A lot of people who listen to this are, definitely like I hear feedback like, wow, that's really helped me figure out my own journey. And even like I hear from a number of people about conversations that are here informing their career path and like how they approach things, because a lot of us in general are just looking for like, what's that thing, what's that dream, or how do we get to that dream that we want to live. Have you thought or processed like how you've been able to, WWE included, but more generally thinking of your career as a storyteller, like have you processed what it's been like, what the ingredients have been to get you to this place where you can live a dream or live your dream?
I think a lot of it is just being so stubborn and just doubling down on the things I love, like my fandoms, whether it's boy band music or wrestling or or Survivor. You know,
Yeah.
for some reason, I was so dead set on just letting people remember that I was the wrestling guy. Like that became my branding. I had wrestling sound effects on my radio show. I hosted a TV show on wrestling, which ran for a couple of seasons as well. So there was always that branding involved. And here in the Philippines, and I guess to an extent in the US as well,
Yeah.
having a very niche branding actually helps. Even though you're not the mainstream name or face where you say that name and everybody knows who that is. Like when you say Ryan Seacrest, everybody knows who that is, right?
Right.
Or, but, you know, I don't have that. I don't think I'll ever get there. And that's just me being self-aware about my limitations. And that's fine. You know, it's fine to know what your limits are. But what I can control is what I put out there in terms of my own identity, my own branding. And when I focused on that, my goal was to conquer something that nobody else had touched.
Right.
So it's a business philosophy I learned from my dad. Like everyone else can go in this direction where everyone is making money or everyone is getting famous. But if you go here, you can take a chance and there's a higher likelihood that you could actually make an impact because you're the only person talking about this particular thing. So that's why I decided to zero in on wrestling. And I guess through luck, timing, and just knowing the right people, I was able to make that happen. And I'm not going to sit here and guarantee that it's going to work for everybody because it's not.
Right.
I was just really, really fortunate that things played out in my favor and that I was so unashamed and unapologetic about my wrestling fandom. Like when people would come up to me and say, you know, that's fake, right? And I'm like, that's predetermined, right? I'd be like, yeah, so what? So is Game of Thrones. So is Breaking Bad.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's powerful, even just because like being stubborn when you know that you have the right path and the right thing for you, like, no, this is what I need to be doing, is powerful, because you could also look back, like, we could look back over this conversation and think about a lot of what you mentioned. Like, I'm someone also who representation is something that has mattered to me. My voice being out there has mattered. Going from like being silenced and feeling like my voice didn't matter, like I couldn't speak, to being able to be heard is huge. And it's still very real to me. And it's like, honestly, a reason why, like, I keep bringing it up because it's on my mind so much, but like this like live reality game with Survivor Philadelphia, I'm talking about, I'm not explicitly talking about representation in there, but like I'm talking about identity to an extent. And like, cause it's real. It's like, yeah, this is a YouTube show that like maybe a few thousand people watch, but like there are people watching and it matters. And and there's a chance for people to hear from you. But I want, as we kind of get to the point where we're wrapping up, I just want to ask you, Stan, and give you kind of like a moment to share like how RHAP has been part of your journey or influenced your journey, because you referenced that earlier, and I know you've mentioned this to me before, but like, yeah, how has Rob as a podcast, a community that I hope you're only just getting, a community that I hope is only just becoming more and more exposed to you. How has this influenced your journey and just your work as a storyteller? Thank you for giving me one word to sum up what you do.
I just want to add on something that you previously
Please.
said.
Yeah.
You mentioned just making sure that your voice is heard and making sure that you represent what you want to represent, right? I mentioned earlier that I struggled with not seeing and hearing people like me, and that's why that's what motivated me as an on-air personality to be authentically myself. Because I figured no one sounded like me, no one looked like me, no one had the same interests as I do from the radio and TV hosts I watched growing up. So I want to be that person for a younger version of me or like a future version of myself, you know?
Right.
If no one can be that for me, then I will be that for me. So that's what I
Ooh.
did. That's why I became that boy band loving 6 foot tall wrestling geek on the radio. And you know, from that realization, I grew a base of listeners. One of whom is now a dear friend. Shout out to Abby. She had really listened to me since day one, just because I was playing wrestling sound effects on the radio. And until now, she still listens to my work just because of how it resonates with her. She's like, you're the first person who was so open about their identity as a Chinese Filipino, as a wrestling fan. And that resonates with me. And I'm like, mission accomplished.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's why that matters. In terms of the question about what the RHAP community means to me, the RHAP or RHAP as a podcast as a whole kept me sane in one of the worst moments of my career. Sometime in 2016, I remember that I was on autopilot and I was on my way out of my first radio station. I was having a conflict with somebody I'd worked with, and radio just wasn't fun anymore. I was literally sighing when I was clocking in and clocking out.
Yeah.
And right around that time, I was playing an online reality game, and I was like, how do I get an advantage over these other fuckers? So I found Rob as a podcast, and there was like this, there was this one off-season podcast about negotiating tactics, which I remember very well. So I listened to that, and I was like, damn, I'm learning so much from this. I can apply it to this game I'm currently playing, but also I'm having fun listening to this. It gets my mind off of like the conflicts in the real world, all of the shit that's been weighing me down. So it just became a source of lightness, a source of fun, to the point that, you know, I carry the podcast with me everywhere. Like when I'm driving, when I'm in the bathroom taking a shower, or when I'm making my coffee in the morning. Like it's there. It's something that just reminds me that things can be a little bit lighter. And that's what I love about it. And, you know, now that the network's expanded and has brought in all these creators, has brought in all these conversations, all these spaces, it's so cool to be a kid from the Philippines. I'm 32. I keep calling myself a kid, Jesus. But it's,
Well, I mean, you're
it's,
a kid, enough of a kid, you know. Hopefully,
Yeah.
there's like a lot, maybe 60 to 70 more years for both of us as 30.
it'll be a while
early
till we get to our
30s.
later days.
Yeah.
But it just blows my mind how, you know, I live half a world away from all you guys, and yet I feel like the conversations are personal, that I get to interact with you guys on social media, on the internet. It's such a safe space. And I know that phrase gets thrown around a lot, especially over the last 5 years, but I really feel it's such a safe space. And it's so nice to just have that, because you don't get that a whole lot on the internet, you know? And even if you're like someone like me, like I'm a straight guy, I'm a cishet straight guy, and sometimes I feel like, you know, it's too bro-y out there. It's too testosterone filled. It's nice to just have a place where everybody can just be themselves. And that's what I salute and applaud all of you for, because everybody just has a place, and it's great.
Yeah, we love that. And I think there's so much more we could talk about, Stan. Like everything we talked about, we could probably dive into for another 3 hours. So this could be an audiobook instead of a podcast. We'll talk about that. Maybe that in the future we'll make an audiobook of your story. But I mean, that brings me to one of my last questions, really, which is just about you and your life. And I ask everyone this, that like, if your life were a book or documentary, what would the title be and why? Stan C, tell me.
Oh, I'm gonna jack the title of the Notorious B.I.G.'s documentary. I got a story to tell.
Why?
Because I got a story to tell.
I was like, I think I get it, but I might as well ask.
I mean, it's right there, right? With the whole professional storyteller bit and just being on the mic, or, you know, writing about stuff. I just think that everybody's got a story to tell. And I just happen to be somebody who doesn't give enough of a crap to like hide everything. Like, you know, there are times when I am okay with just being an open book and just opening up my thoughts and just talking into the mic and just letting it all out there. So I guess I got a story to tell.
We love it. We love it, Stan. Thank you so much for this time together and for like opening up and sharing so much of yourself, because I think that, it's so, I mean, I always hate when I say it because I feel like I say it like on some podcasts more than others a lot, but like representation matters. It's kind of like what you're just saying about a safe space, because I have for like the last decade uh, talked about like the power of safe spaces, and still they're very important, but sometimes like you have these things that become phrases and like it's easy to lose sight of them. Like
Yep.
safe spaces, like you're saying, are important, still important, regardless of what we call them. They're great in terms of what they function as. Representation does matter. And I think we all experience that in different ways, which is like the power of storytelling. But I'm thankful for your story, and I hope that people are able to connect to so many different aspects of it. And, another thing I'll say here is this is like another episode where I'm just thrilled for the people who make it to this point in the episode, or who even like listened. And I talk about this on air with guests, just like transparently recognizing like, Stan, like this is, I hope the people are getting to know you, embracing all the things that you create, checking you out in your number one role as Timothy Chalamet on Netflix and all the other things. But Stan,
I thought you were telling them to check me out, period.
Check you out. Yeah, check him out. Yeah, there was the ASMR earlier too. Just like go back, rewind, take it in. But Stan, I have to give you the floor really. Well, before even like asking you to kind of close us out with any final words, like, is there anything I didn't ask about that you want to mention here?
Probably just that I find it very funny that I'm at a place in my career where I do have a mic literally in front of me at all times. And as someone who grew up being bullied, as someone who grew up being silenced as well,
Yeah.
every time I wanted to talk about the things that was bothering me, I find it quite ironic that now my voice is kind of unavoidable here in the Philippines, because like I bother people whenever my ads show up on YouTube, or I've done work on broadcast media. There's a delicious bit of irony in that, and it is not lost on me. So sometimes when I look back on the things I've done,
Yeah.
that does tickle me.
Yeah, it's powerful, and it's like that's what things could have gone. It's sometimes hard to appreciate how things could have gone a totally different way.
Yeah.
Where like you don't have that. It's scary. I've never thought about this, but like the place where we don't have a platform, or the way like yeah, it's a dark alternate timeline to think of that world where we're not able to like release those things and like find
Where the
our
trauma
voices.
wins over you.
Where the trauma wins over, exactly. But wow, it's like dark to think of that alternate timeline, but really amazing to think. It makes it even more amazing to appreciate where you are, where we are, and even just like the fact that again, I said it earlier in a different context, but like sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good, and like there's a lot to be thankful for in that sense. So Stan, any final words for the people? Just like close us out.
I just want to say thank you first to you, Matt, and to everybody on the Rob as a Podcast community and network for first, just having all these platforms, creating this very safe and wonderful space for everyone to just enjoy the things that they love to enjoy. And thanks for letting me tell my story out here on Pod Friends. I mean, I don't necessarily get to have these opportunities a whole lot, even though I've basically opened up my heart and soul on my own podcast. It's different when somebody else is asking you these questions and forcing you to think of these things from a different perspective. It's great. I really appreciate this opportunity to reflect. And, if it weren't for this network and this community, you and I would not be friends. So I'm really, really grateful for that. I really love how you are a valuable friend in my network, in my circle. And I enjoy all of our conversations. these recorded ones way more just because they're actual conversations
Yeah.
and not us typing on a keyboard and waiting for our time zones to align.
Yeah. Or like me messaging back at 3 a.m. and you're like, you should be sleeping. I'm like, yeah, I know. But thank you so much, Stan. And just something else I want to say as we wrap up is like your story, right back at you and everything you just said. And, I value you as a friend I've never met in person. So I'm assuming you're
Yep.
real. And
I'd like to
really
think I've got
cool, but,
legs.
yeah, I would like to think so too, but I mean, who knows? But yeah, thank you so much, Stan. And I like love like how you've managed to make your own roads to do the places that you are. And I think that's a great lesson for a lot of people. Thank you so much, Stan.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of this week's episode with Stan C. I hope you loved it. I hope you loved the conversation. Stan is someone I admire so much. I still need to learn how to take some of his throat tips for taking care of your throat, taking care of your voice, struggling with that a little bit today. But you know what? We keep going. We keep going on. And, in that spirit, Pod Friends keeps going on. And if you want to be part of it, you could leave a voicemail, speakpipe.com/podfriends. Leave a voicemail up to 90 seconds of something from any of the episodes of Pod Friends or all of the episodes of Pod Friends that's really resonated with you. And we will include them in this season of Pod Friends before the end of September. Definitely tweet me at HeyPodFriends, at MattScottGW. Tweet Stan at _StanC and let him know what you thought of this episode. And of course, you could suggest a guest, bit.ly/PodFriendsNam. Thank you so much for being on this journey, for being part of this. And special shout out to Scott St. Pierre behind the scenes, to Rob Sesternino of Rob Has a Podcast, of course, and Tricky Rice, Chelsea Lesser, everyone else who helps bring Pod Friends to life. So much more is coming up this season. A number of other exciting guests are coming up, so I hope that you're excited to tune in. I hope that you're subscribed. robhaswebsite.com/podfriendsfeed. And until next time, thanks again, everybody. And thank you for being a pod friend.